Our next speaker is Miss Beverly Longid. Miss Longid is a Bontok-Kankanaey of Mountain Province who for decades has been working for the realization of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. She is currently the global coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. Previously, she served as the chairperson of the Cordillera People's Alliance. Welcome, Bev.
Magandang umaga, Lori. Thank you, Lori. Warmest greetings to all our participants and guests in today's Tudtulan webinar series on Indigenous Peoples in the Philippines. Thank you for TFIP for organizing and inviting me to this activity. I have been asked to discuss the salient features of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 or RA 11479 and its implications on Indigenous peoples. So just a bit of a background, the Anti-Terror Act or Terror Law 2020 effectively repeals the Human Security Act of 2007. And as we all know, at the time of pandemic, during the quarantine lockdown, COVID lockdown, Congress railroaded this its passage with the House of Representatives, yung ating House Congress, fully adopting the Senate version without any form of public consultation. And immediately after, or a few days after, the President approved the bill on July 3, and it became effective on July 18, 2020. So, in a nutshell, the Act defines what terrorism is, ano yung purpose nito under Section 4, and then what constitutes the acts of terrorism. 2, it also defines the process on how one is suspected or designated to be a terrorist. And then, of course, last, it provides punishment, no, for those who are convicted, or what are the actions also that government can do to suspected terrorists, people or organizations allegedly linked with terrorists and supporters of terrorists. So let's have a quick look on the definition. So if we look at its definition, no, this is Section 4, it says that terrorism is committed by any person who within or outside the Philippines, regardless of the stage of execution, engages in acts intended to, take note, acts intended to cause death, etc., to cause extensive damage or destruction to a government or public facility, cause extensive interference with or damage or destruction to critical infrastructure, develops, manufactures, or possesses or uses weapons, explosive, etc., and then the release of dangerous substances. The law also further provides that these acts are being done with the following purpose, no? It's to intimidate the public, or it creates an atmosphere of fear, or it will provoke or influence government by intimidation, or to destabilize or destroy fundamental structures of the country and create a public emergency. So if you combine those acts intended to and the purpose, you can be found guilty of committing terrorism. So what's our critique on this definition? If you look at it, as many has already pointed out, the definition actually is very broad and very vague. It's a catch-all, no? Catch-all definition that anything practically under the sky can fall under the definition of terrorism. Sa ganito pong definition, kahit sino or kahit na anong organisasyon ay pwedeng pumaloob dun sa kanilang sinasabing definition. It is very dangerous. It is very dangerous for indigenous peoples because if you look, let's take a look at the case of the barricade in Didipio, Nueva Vizcaya. Under the law, this can be considered as an act of terrorism under yung definition niya na engages in acts that will intend to cause damage or destruction to a government or public facility or interference with something that's considered as a critical infrastructure. Gaya nga ng sinabi ni Tyrone, under the build, mining is one of the priority investments of governments. Therefore, yung pagbabarikada ng mga mamamayan ng Dulupirip under against Oceana Gold can fall under this definition. Especially if you take it in consonance with yung intimidate the general public, kasi nga baka para pumayag o suportahan yung mamamayan ng DDPO against Oceana Gold, or to influence by intimidation dahil sila ay nagbabarikada yung government to finally act on the expired FTAA of Oceana Gold, or pwede nilang tignan na ito ay part of destabilization of important structures in the country. So the law does not actually provide anything that will guide people kung ano ba ang illegal o ano ba ang legal. Kasi nga ang wala siyang binibigay na parameters kung ano ba yung dapat na iwasan ng mga mamamayan. Liban pa dito dun sa kanyang definition on what is terrorism, is that it will also provide penalty for certain acts like, next slide. It will also provide punishment for the following acts, no? Like in planning, training, preparing, and facilitating the commission of terrorism, etc. Ito ay with life imprisonment and no benefit of parole and bail. Take note of Section 10, yung recruitment to and membership in a terrorist organization. And then you can also be found guilty for 12 years if you commit yung threat to commit terrorism, proposal to commit terrorism, and inciting to commit terrorism. Ano naman yung pagtingin natin dito? Even before the passage of the law, the government, especially state security forces, have already publicly terror tagged indigenous peoples, communities, organizations, leaders, and their advocates. And dyan nga, yung knowing thy enemy and trinity of war as early as 2005 or even before that, yung mga maraming IP organizations like the Cordillera People's Alliance, Katribu, and the member organizations of Kalumaram have been tagged already as front organizations of the CPP NPA. There is a so-called order of battle, and in the case of the Cordillera, several lists have already been nakuha, wherein enemies of the states are tagged for subject for neutralization. In fact, yung OB list na to has become a hit list or a death list. And as mentioned by Tyron, yung counterinsurgency programs ng government, lalo na ngayon na nakafocus sa mga indigenous peoples, ay meron nitong ganito ng vilification and tagging. And recently, with social media, grabe din yung vilification, as in the case of yung chairperson ng Cordillera People's Alliance, na hindi lang siya, but including his family and his children, and one of which is a minor. At nakita rin natin, kunwari ito, yung recent na mga news nangyari sa Davao, wherein you have leaders or members of progressive organizations with their faces posted in different parts of the city saying that they are terrorists or members of the CPP NPA. Ngayon, sinasabi, if you remember, sabi nga ni Congressman Torres, dapat basahin natin yung batas kasi in the law, it provides for an exemption. Next slide, wherein you see that sinasabi niya na yung advocacy, yung mga protesta, dissent, etc. ay hindi kasama na makla-classify as an act of terrorism. But what the congresswoman did not mention is that there's an exemption to the exemption. Hindi nga matatawag to na act of terrorism basta it is not intended to cause death, etc., physical harm, endanger a person's life, or to create a serious risk to public safety. In other words, yung still, the exercise of the rights to free expression and to peaceably assemble for redress of grievances can be classified as an act of terrorism. All the law enforcers have to say is, or to prove, is that any of the three elements of harm, danger, and public safety is present. Therefore, that can be a valid exercise of these rights can still be construed as an act of terrorism, as we have seen in previous activities. The second important part of the law is yung paano ba, how does one be designated as a terrorist? One is that the law provides the creation of an anti-terrorism council na ang tawag po dito ay terror council, and this is a small group of people, as you can see on the screen, mga group of unelected officials, all appointed by the president and none of whom are judges, and they have the absolute power to authorize the police and even the military to arrest without warrant anybody they suspect, even if wrongly, mistakenly, or maliciously, as a terrorist, and detain them without charges for 10 to 24 days. Take note also, under this Terror Council, member po dito yung NSA, the National Security Advisor, who also heads the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict in the Philippines, NTF-LCAC. And as mentioned earlier, this has been responsible for the very vicious attacks on indigenous peoples, their organizations, their leaders, and their communities. Take note also that the Secretary of Justice is part of this Terror Council na kung maalala natin ay yung Department of Justice was responsible in including more than 600 individuals in its petition to prescribe the CPP-NPA as a terror organization. And they did this without any form of investigation or verification. The list included me, the list included the chairman of the CPA, Windel Bulingat, the co-convener of Sandugo, Joanna Carino, and then si Dato Jomorito Goainon, who is currently in jail. Take note also that the DOJ, through its prosecutors, have been responsible in filing trump-up charges against indigenous peoples leaders. Like I think Rachel Mariano will be giving her testimony, and that is a concrete example on how prosecution can file up trump-up charges against activists. The second process wherein you can be designated, next slide, as a terrorist is that under the law, it allows the courts to preliminarily declare groups as terrorists within 72 hours without really a fair chance to contrast it. It means that persons can be labeled a terrorist upon designation of the government without really requiring the said person the opportunity to oppose or present contrary evidence. Kaya pwede kang mahuli for being a member of an organization that is unilaterally and administratively declared as a terrorist. So these are some examples of the vilification in social media. So in effect, what happens, next slide, it has a chilling effect on the exercise of the fundamental freedom of speech and assembly, and it also restricts the right to association. Aside from that, a person who is suspected as a terrorist can also suffer from warrantless arrest, next slide, and prolonged detention, as I mentioned earlier. You can also be subjected to surveillance, next slide, and your financial accounts can be frozen, and then your right to travel can also be restricted. You can also be put on house arrest, or pwedeng yung within the municipality lang, kung nasaan ka nakatira, diyan ka pwedeng gumalaw, or at most, your passport can also be canceled. So kung yung mga katutubong mamamayan are subjected to this, it really has an impact on the livelihood. At the same time, most of us, indigenous peoples, live in areas that are far from the town centers where the courts and jails are located. Kaya dagdag pa na gastusin yung pagpunta mo sa bayan to attend your hearings o sa case ng may kamag-anak kang nakulong, dagdag pa na gastos para bisitahin mo yung mga kamag-anak mo. Now, baka sinasabi niyo, haka-haka lang naman yan, wala pa naman hinuhuli under the Anti-Terror Act. But we do have an experience under the old Human Security Act of 2007, wherein two of indigenous peoples na have been subjected by this to this law. Ito yung case ni Edgar Candule, isang Aita sa Zambales, and of course si Dato Jo Morito Goainon, na both of them have been charged under Human Security Act, and the court eventually dismissed this because of absence of any evidence. But prior to this, ang ginamit ng gobyerno was to claim that they are members or leaders of the New People's Army. Si Jubong, while the charges against him under the HSA 2007 has been dropped, he is still in jail because he was charged subsequently with other set of criminal charges. And then what is also very, very bad about itong Terror Act of 2020, kung dati-dati, doon sa previous law, it provides for penalties for law enforcers who do not follow the rules as far as arrest. Under the new law, nawala na po yan, kahit na yung tawag nito, yung fine na 500,000 if the charge of terrorism has been unproven. So with all of this, how should we look at the law? One, I think that the terror law is nothing but an added ammunition to existing arsenal of repressive laws. Kasi nandiyan pa naman yung mga ibang batas as far as warrantless arrest, yung sa checkpoints, yung search and seizures, nandiyan pa rin naman yan. Matagal na panahon, our rights have been violated by the government itself. So in essence, it legalizes state terrorism. Ito nga lang this week, we have seen the brutal killing of peasant leader Carandal Etianis, and then the day that he was buried, the other day, binaril naman itong isang human rights worker na si Sara Alvarez. And then it abuses those violations perpetrated by the state. So anyway, it has the effect of really silencing this dissent, any form of dissent or even critique, and furthers state impunity. So what can we do? Last, I think it's very important that we continue to protest and speak up. Ito, I adapted it from the column of Professor Lavinia, na kahit natatakot tayo, it is understandable at this time, but it's still important na hindi tayo napaparilisa dahil sa ating takot. Two, will be a challenge among all human rights and pro-democracy Filipinos to be able to come out with a united front to oppose this law and the state terror that follows with the operation of the law. We can still file cases or join already existing petitions questioning the constitutionality of the law. Sa hanay po natin ng mga Katutubong Mamamayan at Moro, we were able to file it last week. Tayo po yung number 27 and petition. Tapos mahalaga din na we, in the protest, in the activities that we do, we remain vigilant. Kasi as I mentioned, yung elements of harm, danger, ay kailangan nating bantayan because infiltrators could probably hijack our protest and it will endanger everyone. We can also still do, next slide, tawag nito, sa panahon ngayon, we have to really be familiar with our human rights. Kailangan ipaalam natin sa ating mga pamilya, kamag-anak o kabahay kung saan tayo pupunta, lalo na kung mag-a-attend tayo ng rally. Tapos dapat may listahan din tayo ng mga lawyers kung sakaling na pwede nating tawagan kung tayo ay mahuli. Kung ako, I always have this in my wallet. It's the bus card ng karapatan, ano yung pwede niyong gawin, and then I listed the names of my lawyers and the numbers na pwede ko silang tawagan. We can still lobby Congress to repeal the law and probably to enact a better one that will really look into terrorism but still respect human rights. And we should still also do lobby the UNs and its agencies and mechanisms, lalong-lalo na para suportahan yung report ng High Commissioner on the human rights situation in the Philippines, and then to condemn the worsening human rights situation. We can also lobby foreign governments to stop military aid to the Philippines, especially in cases where this aid is being used for military operations in indigenous peoples' communities. We can also enjoin other civil society organizations, the churches, or even financial institutions to support our campaign. Siguro ito medyo mahirap tignan ng mga iba, but if all fails as far as judicial remedies, then probably we can participate in the drafting of the implementing rules. Pero gaya nga ng sabi ni Dean Lavinia, it might be tricky because it could be perceived as accepting the law. But nonetheless, if it's still part of the protest, maybe we can support such endeavors as a last resort. So with this, I think I ran out of time. Yun po ang tingin ko na salient points, and then it will also be useful at this point to go back to the Bill of Rights under a Constitution para makita natin kung ano ba yung mga karapatan na nilalabag ng batas na ito pero guaranteed